Helo a chroeso I gynhadledd ddigidol Engage for Success Cymru 2020. Bydd ein gynhadledd yn canolbwyntio ar ymgysylltu â gweithwyr a bydd ni'n canolbwyntio ar bob un o'r 4 galluogwr ymgysylltu â gweithwyr drwy lens y 7 nod llesiant o fewn y 10 llesiant cenedlaethau'r dyfodol yng Nghymru. Hello and welcome to Engage for Success Wales's Digital Conference 2020. Our conference will focus on employee engagement and we'll be shining a light on each of the 4 enablers of employee engagement through the lens of the 7 well-being goals of the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act in Wales. This year, we are delighted to be bringing this to you in association with Business News Wales. Diolch yn fawr iawn. In 2009, the MacLeod report was published. Its authors, David MacLeod and Nita Clark, were commissioned to conduct research into high-performing organisations across all sectors. And to elicit what these high-performing organisations had in common, their research found that there were 4 common themes. Firstly, they had visible, empowering leadership which provided a strong, strategic narrative about the organisation, where it had come from and where it was going. Secondly, each organisation had engaging managers who focused on their people, who coached and stretched them to reach their potential, and who treated each person as an individual. Thirdly, there was a strong employee voice throughout the organisations. Employees were seen as central to the solution, to be involved, listened to, and invited to contribute their experience, expertise, and ideas. Finally, they had organisational integrity, meaning that the values on the wall were genuinely reflected in day-to-day behaviours. There was no say-do gap, promises made were promises kept, or an explanation was given as to why not. These 4 common themes of strategic narrative, engaging managers, employee voice, and organisational integrity were defined as the 4 enablers of engagement. But why does employee engagement matter? It matters because there is a direct correlation between levels of employee engagement and levels of productivity, revenue growth and net profit, employee turnover, customer satisfaction, innovation, efficiency, and even health and safety. The analysis of evidence shows only around 1/3 of UK employees say they are actively engaged. 20 million workers are not delivering their full capability or realising their potential at work. 64% of people say they have more to offer in skills and talents than they are currently being asked to contribute at work. There is no doubt that 2020 has been economically challenging, with a slump in GDP and a huge increase in unemployment. This area of employee engagement is something within our influence to change, something that can assist in business growth at a time when so many businesses are under huge pressures. On behalf of Engage for Success Wales, may I thank our sponsors, the Wales Cooperative Centre, for this session. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Finally, our conference is a not-for-profit venture. All attendance is free and profits will be donated to our partner charity, Daring to Dream. Donations can be made via www.daringtodream.wales and will help support the emotional health and well-being of patients in Wales. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Hello and welcome to this conversation as part of the Engage for Success series of conversations that are being organised in association with Business News Wales. I'm Derek Walker, I'm Chief Executive of the Wales Cooperative Centre and I'll be chairing today's discussion. The subject of our discussion today is to think about the well-being goals and whether a reframing of the well-being goals can support the engagement of businesses in the objectives of the Future Generations Act, but also can support employee engagement in Wales. So a really topical and interesting conversation. I am joined by 2 guest contributors. First of all, can I ask you to introduce yourself? So Professor Rachel Ashworth from Cardiff Business School. Rachel.
Thanks, Derek. Pranam da pawb. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name's Rachel Ashworth and I am Dean and Head of Cardiff Business School.
Thanks, Rachel. And Richard, could I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Richard Selby, Director of ProSteel Engineering based in Pontypool and the current new chair of the Institute of Directors in Wales.
Welcome. Thank you both. Good to see you. And so I'm Derek Walker, I'm Chief Executive of the Wales Cooperative Centre, and we're sponsoring today's conversation. The Wales Cooperative Centre is an economic development agency to promote and develop social enterprises and cooperative businesses. And those businesses often work to a triple bottom line of economy, social, and the environmental objectives. So fitting very nicely into the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act and into this conversation today. So let's start the conversation and explore the topic. As I see it, we're looking at the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. We're looking at its impact on Wales, but also on the private sector and how it can be a mechanism for greater employee engagement. Just to give you a background on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, if you haven't been aware of it, I'm sure many people are, because it's seen as groundbreaking legislation and legislation that is often looked at from outside Wales as a model for taking to other countries. And I think there has been campaigns in England for similar legislation in recent times. It was brought in back in 2015, and it looks at how you bring together economic, social, environmental, and cultural objectives. So put simply, it's about improving the economy, society, environmental, and cultural aspects of Wales, and has at its heart 7 well-being goals. One of which is the focus of our conversation today, which is around prosperity. So the 7 well-being goals are easily looked up, but I'll tell you them very quickly. A prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, a healthier Wales, a globally responsible Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, and a Wales of vibrant culture and a thriving Welsh language. So it has plenty of ambition, and it applies to the public sector in Wales, the devolved public sector in Wales. It doesn't apply directly to private sector organisations. And one of perhaps the most interesting parts for me of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is the way that it has 5 ways of working which run across the Act and encourage public bodies to work perhaps differently than they have done previously. So those are about working over the long term. They're about thinking about prevention. They're supporting collaboration between public bodies, supporting integration across the well-being goals, so they're not looked at in isolation. And they're also very much about involving people, diverse communities, the people of Wales, the people receiving the services in the delivery of those services. So it's all encompassing, and it's overseen by the Office of the Future Generations Commission, and our commissioner is Sophie Howe, who supports public bodies in the delivery of those objectives. So that frames our discussion. So I guess the first question is, could a reframing of the Future Generations Act and the Wellbeing Goals help us to engage the business community in this agenda? And could it also look to improve employee engagement? Employee engagement is crucial to productivity and people's job satisfaction and all sorts of other well-being aspects. And an important part of that, one of the 4 enablers of employee engagement, is organizational integrity. So understanding whether organizational integrity that could be driven by the Future Generations Act and a reframing of the Act could support employee engagement in Wales. So I thought I'd start by stop talking and ask a question instead. Where you think we are in terms of employee engagement in Wales? Is it in a good place? Is there more to do? where do you think the position is in terms of employee engagement within the Welsh public sector? Private sector, sorry. Perhaps I'll start with you, Richard, as an MD of a private sector firm. What are your thoughts?
I think it's been a very difficult 7 months, and there's businesses which have put their arm around their staff and supported them very, very well. And you would hope that that's been well received by the team members, and you know, the impact on the businesses has accordingly improved. There are those obviously that haven't, and they've had a very difficult time, and I think it's upon all of us really to try and support those businesses who've had a difficult time. That said, you know, not everybody is a leader of a business who's doing the right things for their people, and I think that's where we need to call them out to stand up for the principles and the facets of responsibilities of being a director, and ensure that employees are valued such that they can feel like they have a belonging to the organisation. Excuse me. It's as I say, been a very interesting time, and I think, speaking from my own business perspective, we've been bowled over by the support that employees have brought to the table. Everybody has been very responsible in terms of their response to the pandemic. You know, we've had some staff off up to 4 times with track and trace, and it's been incredibly disruptive for them and incredibly disruptive for us. But that's where the team comes, and I think if there's one thing about this pandemic, it's that pulling together, and hopefully we can hold on to that as we move into the economic recovery.
Thank you, Richard. So what do you think, Rachel? I mean, I guess Richard's saying there that to some extent employee engagement has been more important during this crisis, and even though businesses have often have to, you know, survive this, you know, looking at survival rather than growth, employee engagement has been key to that. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think, you know, the concept of employee engagement is one that gets sort of interpreted, reinterpreted, you know, redefined. It's something that's actually quite slippery and really hard to sort of measure and get a handle on. So I think we would normally describe it as a kind of passion for work, where it involves 3 levels of engagement, I suppose. One is a kind of cognitive sort of understanding about your organisation, your leader of your organisation, and working practices. And then the second is an emotional reaction to that. Does what you see or understand make you feel more, you know, happy, engaged, enthusiastic? Does it make you feel negative? And then there's a physical dimension as well, which is about your energy for work. So if we think about those 3 elements, then we can see how they would have been really severely challenged through COVID, when we've seen just a dramatic change to the way of working, whether you are working in person and you've had to be protected physically, and we're focused on safety, whether you're working at home, and, you know, you need different provisions and concerns there about well-being. So, you know, the concept as we understand it, I think, has been through a rework just because of COVID. And if we think about it in terms of Wales and the Welsh economy, it's normally a tale of 2 halves, isn't it? Maybe, you know, we know we have some shining examples of organisations that seem to have cracked employee engagement, your Admirals of the world, also smaller organisation, Hyatt Jeans in Cardigan. Some of are also our third sector voluntary organisations, Chwaraeteg, the Future Generations Office itself. You know, their employment practices show how you can empower, trust your employees to make their own decisions and be less sort of paternalistic. But then we know there's another side of the economy where for employers and employees, it's much more challenging. And, you know, there are issues of fair sort of remuneration and terms and conditions, challenging competitive markets. And so I think we've got that dichotomy in Wales. What I think maybe we could do a bit better at is sharing some of the good practice, or just different practices from different parts of the economy together. And I don't think we've quite got the vehicle for that yet. But just, you know, if we, even through the pandemic, I know through Institute of Directors, you've had many sessions together but just sort of transferring some of these lessons, what we've learned, what's worked, what hasn't, would really help us, I think, if we could do that a bit more systematically, because I think there is a lot of good stuff that is going on, but we don't often hear an awful lot about it. But there are challenges as well that we can't deny.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and I guess it gets to the nub of what we're talking about here. I guess those businesses that are doing a good job of this are always going to be doing a good job, or hopefully will always be doing a good job. What we've got to think about is how we encourage more businesses to focus on employee engagement and support them to do a better job of that, because we know it's the right thing for the business and for the people that work for the business. So it's reaching the other half, or whether it's a half or not, it's the other those other businesses that don't not doing this now. I mean, Richard, back to you. The question, I guess, is whether a reframing of the well-being goals could help with engaging more businesses. The Act doesn't apply to the private sector at the moment in Wales, yet I guess the private sector is affected because it trades with the public sector. I mean, what are your thoughts about whether the Act could be reframed to put a well-being goal around the economy, a well-being economy, at the heart of it, and so that it applied more widely to the private sector in Wales?
Well, I think as a nation, the Future Generations Act is an absolute unique selling point for Wales. And it's something that we should be proud of in terms of its high-level goals and opportunities. Where I think it gets more difficult is when you dig down in terms of what those priorities mean to individual businesses. Now, out of the 7 goals, there's some that will be easy for business to attend to and achieve, and there's some that won't. But by and large, I think what we have to recognize is that business needs cash and it needs profits before it can do anything else. And how do we do that and then ensure that businesses comply with the other obligations related to the Future Generations Act? So I think it's really given that visibility to businesses rather than a load of information that might be contained within some very nice looking documentation. But let's be clear. Yes, we want to provide a nice place for our kids to grow up in and work and enjoy their lives. But at the same time, what is that realistic roadmap to get there? And let's be honest about using the Act as a reason to do things, not a reason not to do things, as maybe some perception at the moment. And I think that's what we need to work upon.
That's interesting, Richard. So just to follow up on that, would you say that certainly a reframing is needed so that it applies more appropriate to businesses? So, as you were saying, some of the goals are perhaps more relevant than others in your view, but also in terms of it needs to be done in a way that businesses can work with. Perhaps they don't have the resources perhaps to do it in the same way as the public sector
Yes.
Works to the Act, but it needs to be a different approach, perhaps.
You would, for a typical SME, you would struggle to have somebody who could uniquely oversee this on a roadmap within an organization to get them fully compliant. I think what we need to be looking at more holistically is, are organizations playing their part generally? Is the leadership being responsible in terms of the approach to ESG, and are they engaging with their staff, with the local communities in order to fulfill the obligations of the Act? Now, from my own perspective of looking at it, some of the goals are easy to adhere to, some aren't, and I think that discussion is something that we need to take forward. But by and large, we could take it at a high level and say, well, what does Wales want to look like in the future? What are the industries of the future? And how does that look with the Future Generations Act? You know, how do we use this to say, well, let's build on our renewable energy with the Act in mind and bring private sector with us?
So that's almost looking at it in policy terms and strategy terms for Wales as a whole, and looking at those industries that can deliver on it and supporting them.
And how do we adapt our existing industries to work in the new ones of the future? You know, and I think that's the role really where the collaboration between public and private sector can work well, is making that shift as seamless as possible.
What do you think, Rachel, about Richard's points there about certainly a lot of the intentions of the Wellbeing Act could be, very relevant for businesses. How it might be applied might be quite different for the business sector.
I've always felt from the beginning that we wouldn't achieve these wellbeing goals unless the private sector was heavily engaged. It wasn't just a matter of public service organisations in Wales doing this stuff. And I think we always, we assume then that the business organisations aren't doing this, when actually we need to learn actually in some of our organisations from some of the leading private business organisations who are incredibly responsible employers and doing, really cutting edge work in this area. And I think if we think, it's too simplistic to say, well, a prosperous Wales, that's down to the business community. It's down to all of us, actually. So one of the things we try to do in my organisation, I know you do it in yours too, Derek, is we've looked at our supply chain. We spend a lot of money. Where are we spending that money? We're now spending it in Wales with Welsh businesses, social enterprises and others. And we're working to create that foundational, circular economy in Wales. So we all have a role to play in creating the prosperous Wales. We actually, as citizens, have a role to play in supporting the Welsh government making decisions which mean that there can be pay uplifts in Wales, for example. So I think it's a broader sense of responsibility than just attributing it to business. But I think the reframing I think we'd all be supportive of that, but COVID has really reframed it for us. We can't rewind the last 8 months or whatever it is. We are where we are now, and I think it has made us reassess what's important to us. I do think community, locality, neighbourliness has become more significant. There are key workers, not just key workers, but key organisations that we know now we rely on, whether that's in social care delivery, drivers and companies, supermarket workers. These are the people that we couldn't live without for those few months, certainly at the beginning. And I think, it's about time that we place a higher value, not just on the individual work, but the organisations that are carrying out that work. So there's a little bit of rebalancing, reshaping of our values, what's become important, what we used to think was essential, we don't think is essential any longer. And a lot to learn from some of the practices that we've seen develop over the pandemic, how we've managed in some cases to achieve better work-life balances for some people by combining that sort of working from home with being in work, and what we can take forward from that. So I think the reframing is happening, and it's then how we all sort of play our part in the agenda in relation not just to one goal, but to every single one of those goals.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I guess then it's the how we do that. So I guess the concept we're talking about here is the Future Generations Act, the wellbeing goals can support businesses to deliver on their own objectives, but it also by adopting it more effectively, it can help with employee engagement. So how do we bring businesses on this journey, Richard? I guess when I speak to business people about this, legislation and compulsion is often not what they're looking for. Yeah, you're tutting, but business-led initiatives, that's often what you hear. That is, owned and delivered by business, and not being told what to do by government, but involving businesses. What would your perspective be on how we bring businesses within the Institute of Directors and FSB and others on board with this?
Well, I think
more on board.
Well, one of the easiest ways is obviously through procurement, and I think if we haven't cracked procurement in Wales yet, and we might think we have, But on a broad basis, we still, even when you've got tenders which are split between quality, price, and social well-being, it fundamentally always comes back to price, and how we balance that with the value of the social context is something I'm not going to give you an answer to today, Derek, but I think is something we need to establish what that value is. We see difficult and disappointing decisions being made all of the time in terms of procurement, and they could be adding so much more value. And I think when business is not worried about how it's going to pay the salaries every month, or whether it's going to be able to pay its bills at the end of the month, then you start creating the bandwidth to be able to improve these social aspects. And I think that's where we've got to get to. If we can say, right, well, as a nation, this is the amount of work that's coming, this is what's available, and if we could do some facilitation with the public sector in terms of what do supply chains look like locally. We're doing it in Torvine at the moment, trying to map out what businesses are doing what where, and how could we encourage people to work together closely. There's got to be some benefits to me buying my products in Glenavon as opposed to buying them in from Middlesbrough, but what we don't know is who's doing what where, which seems crazy, but I think wouldn't take a lot of work for somebody to pull that piece together.
Yeah, I think it's quite detailed work, that, isn't it, Richard? I mean, it's not perhaps complicated, but it's
the data's there.
There's work to do to map all that out, isn't there, and to understand what's happening and what needs to change in order to make more of it happen.
Yeah, and something that we've looked at is, right, well, what businesses aren't here that need to provide the goods or services that we need? Can we incubate some? Can we actually get some businesses to pivot into doing these new things that we need locally and improve local employment opportunities?
Rachel, I mean, the procurement point comes up a lot, doesn't it, in conversations like this? And yeah, it's been great to see the business school led by you doing much more to think about where you spend your money as a public value business school. Do you think these sorts of things can help with employee engagement? So, the people that work with you, your team, you're creating a narrative around the school and how it is and how you spend your money. Do you think that is helpful for employee involvement and engagement in the work of the business school?
Yeah, because I do think that, employees are usually attached to their organisation, they're proud of their organisation, they're also proud of their community and locality. And we know actually that we do have something quite special here in Wales in terms of their attachment to the country. And so, in our case, where we've seen a series of developments with social enterprises supplying anything from our coffee to our office refurbishments and so on, then we've seen teams of colleagues getting involved, feeling they can come forward and say, well, I know this company here that does X, can we have a look at that? And I think part of engaging in the goals is to say, well, why not? Why can't we do that? And that has meant for me, within a bigger institution of the university, say, getting these people onto our supply lists. And, now the number of us from the business school are on the university's new procurement board to try and influence the next layer up, which is university procurement. So I think, yeah, it can make people more involved in projects. It can make people feel proud of what their employer is doing to help that broader society and economy. So in our experience, it has been a huge positive, but it does involve you being more flexible and running with things that maybe in the past you wouldn't have. And some of them may not always work, but, we take risks all the time. And I think taking risk with a company that's just down the road is probably a better thing to do than taking a risk with a company that's thousands of miles away. But I think it is nervy at the beginning to do this kind of thing on your own, because I know when we first said we were a public value business school, we want to contribute to society and the economy, it was a bit, our other business schools, competitors were kind of, what are they doing? This is a little bit odd. And you do feel a little bit nervous going out on your own. So I do think a big part of this is operating as a network ourselves, of organisations, because every business organisation wants to contribute to society and the economy. That's why they established the business in the first place. So it's just that nervousness about being the only one maybe that's doing X, and also I think there is this there will be an anxiety about the bottom line, and it is, you know, we live in a society, I hope, where we're mature enough to say it is okay to make a profit. We do need to make profit. It's all about how that profit is invested. It's all about actually how your profits can be boosted and productivity can be boosted by doing certain things in your organization. And maybe we need to get better at sharing a lot of evidence around that to show that if you do take that leap of faith, then you can know that productivity will be enhanced as a result, and you will see those broader benefits for your organization and community.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, isn't it? Making that case with those sorts of arguments, and I'm sure there's good evidence out there, but they're not always harnessed to and made available. So Richard, thinking about the private sector, your own organisation, how how have you seen employees being engaged, and how is that working in relation to things like the Future Generations Act? So for example, one of the things that was distributed as part of a blog ahead of this conversation is these 4 enablers about employee engagement. So good management, strong narrative, employee voice and say, and what's the other one? The 4th, I'll come back to it in a minute, but those were 3 of them. How have you seen that linked to what's going on in the private sector, and how can we link them? Can it be helped by the wellbeing goals being encouraged and promoted within the private sector?
Yeah, I think one thing that we have to do a lot of is talk to our staff, and not predominantly we're talking to our staff about keeping safe and what they've got to do every day. And I think what we need to be doing is talking a bit more about the bigger picture. What we often find when we started on a consultation process where we have sort of asked the management every month questions, we had about 3 months of can we get extra money for our overtime? When can we have a pay rise? And once we got through those discussions, then we actually got into, well, actually, if we change the bit type in that saw over there, I think we can cut that bit of steel a bit faster. And then we really got to some interesting conversations, because these are the people that are seeing, living and breathing what we're doing every day. How do I know, the best way to put bits of steel together? I don't go out there, but these guys do, and I think encouraging that openness in the discussion and sharing with them where our opportunities are as a business, where we see, the pandemic going, how it's going to affect us, are we resilient enough, and having that honesty in those conversations, I think really does buy in, for the staff to want to actually contribute, and when things get tough for us as a business, hopefully that they'll come to us and put their hands up to help out, and we're seeing that, and I think something we're doing at the Institute of Directors is trying to build this community of leaders, and I think what we're doing here in Wales is trying to build a series of these communities, whether it's with our own teams in our own businesses, and it's across the wider local authority areas or the regions. And I think what Rachel's saying about being open and bold enough to collaborate with other people and see the long game of the benefits in terms of productivity is what we need to encourage and get the message out there that, okay, the next few months are going to be hard and we're going to get through it. But the real benefit in 18 months' time is we've done this team working together and we're all going to get a lift in our businesses. And that's really, I think, when the magic will come and the benefits of the act like this will really play its part. But it's just getting people to share that vision. And I think the reason why we're all here today is we're going to keep having this conversation to share it, I think.
Well, that's right, isn't it? It's all about the communication and talking about it, isn't it? and spreading the good practice. The fourth enabler, of course, is organisational integrity. That was the one I was escaped me, and actually, you know, very closely related to the subject of this conversation. And organisational integrity, I guess, is the values of the organisation, and also this idea that the organisation and the leadership does what it says it's going to do. There's no difference between what the organisation says it's about and what it actually does. The say-do gap. There's no big say-do gap. You know, what are your thoughts on that, Rachel, on how we support organizational integrity in that way, and where we can you know, encourage organizations to do what they say they do, and how important that is?
Yeah, I think it's one of the your nervousness around this agenda is that you've got to be you're all perfectionists. We want to be able to do all of this perfectly, and we're not going to get there immediately. So it is taking small steps towards it. But I think there is an element of living and breathing. You know, if we're going to be organizations with that broader purpose, then we have to walk the talk. And we will be challenged by our employees, by our stakeholders, in my case, by our students, who, you know, if they think that we're not living up to our own purpose. So some of that is, like I said, looking at, you know, for us, let's say as a business school, not just what we teach or research, how do we spend our money? What are our employment practices like? You know, what are the issues? Are we engaged in the city and the country in terms of helping to support and address issues? So you have to keep challenging yourself. And one of the things that we did in the early days was set up a counter board in the school to our management board, so that we have continual sort of challenge from the front line, from colleagues who actually care a lot about the school, but they are not thinking about this year's budget or this year's student numbers. They are thinking about 5 years' time, what kind of, you know, business school they want it to be. And that can be challenging, but it is part of you know, good governance, if you like, which is another element of what we should be doing. But I agree with Richard. I think there's a strong, you know, sense that if we can do things together. So I'm thinking about work we've done on the real living wage in Cardiff in the city, where, you know, we work together as a group. There are a number of anchor institutions, but lots of small businesses, lots of social enterprises, and together we are all working towards lifting pay up in the city. And it feels so good to be able to do that together, and then be able to say X employees in the city get this level of pay and this sort of thing, you know. So there's you're doing it by yourself, but to do it as part of a team and then see the ripple effects on the whole of the Welsh society and economy is just, you know, a real boost. So I think the more that we can network and collaborate, so use the future generation ways of working to be better integrated and achieve these goals together, the better, really.
What level of awareness on that point, Richard, would you say there is about the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act amongst businesses? Is there a good level of awareness already? I know it's not applying directly to them, but good knowledge.
Those of us that are involved with public sector contracts are generally very well aware, I would say. Those that don't engage so much with the public sector probably don't even consider it. I suppose, and that's one of the issues when I suppose when big decisions perhaps made where the future generations has had an impact, but necessarily business sees it's not what they want to see as a decision, and then they're seeing it as a hindrance rather than a help to the organisations. And I think what we could really do is sooner rather than later is really getting a voice in with the future generations team and having that private sector input, so that business comes along with the journey of the future generation and can influence the shape of it as it evolves.
Can I just come in on one of the challenges, I think, Derek, with the major challenge here that we all face is that element of long-term versus short-term. And we're seeing this, aren't we? Really, COVID is throwing this into sharp relief. But there are some decisions there where in our heart of hearts, long-term, we might know that's actually the best decision for the planet, let's say. But in the short term, we find that it could hurt us. It could hurt jobs, or it could hurt businesses or whatever. So I think that is probably the heart of the issue that we're trying to grapple with, how we balance long-term and short-term. It's not easy, and I think that's again where we may be able to learn from other contexts, or maybe just together work through how we can deal with that, because we know there will be long-term gain, but it's hard for us as leaders in an organization for a short period of time to handle the short-term pain that might come with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really fundamental point, isn't it? And it's not just by saying we're going to think about the long term, of course, that's not going to necessarily lead to a lot of results, but you need sort of policy, financial, other incentives, support from others, to really, understanding of how others are doing it, really to move along that thinking. So, what I've got really from this conversation is, and tell me if I'm not getting this right, is, we think the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act is, a very positive thing. It's making a difference in the public sector. It's got absolutely the right intentions. It has relevance for the private sector. Some of the private sector are already linked into it and thinking about it because of procurement, because of relationships with the public sector. But there's a job to do in terms of making those links stronger, perhaps talking the language of business more clearly when talking about the Future Generations Act, so we can communicate the relevance to the private sector. And we need to think about other ways of supporting the private sector to engage with this agenda. But there's certainly, for many, Richard, I think what you're saying is there would be an open door and an interest in doing that. And what I'm hearing is it can be a tool for all sorts of things, but it can also be a tool for employee engagement in the private sector. So thinking about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and how it can help organizations create a strong narrative or act with integrity, or think about how employees are engaged, can all be very important in terms of employee engagement within the private sector. Is that a fair summary? Have I got it about right? Yeah. Richard, you're not nodding. Rachel, no, you're not. Yeah, no, okay, good.
I was in thought.
You're in thought, okay.
I was in thought because I think, it is clear that a company is more than just an economic unit generating wealth. And it has a responsibility beyond its shareholders, to its stakeholders. And I think the Future Generations Act is one way of delivering upon that and utilizing facets of it. And I think it is a way of differentiating in a way that could make us more attractive as a nation for doing business. And I think that is something we should embrace.
You broke up a bit. Did you say differentiating us as a
nation?
Yeah, as a nation,
and as a destination where business should be done.
This is a country of fair work, of thinking in the long term, of all the aspects of the well-being goals are considered in all aspects of our society. We're creating a different country here, and that could be good for business. That's what you're saying, Richard. Great.
Absolutely.
Rachel, and what's your final thoughts? I mean, where do we go from here? How do we take this forward? What would your advice be on that?
Well, I think, what COVID-19 has showed us, I mean, it has laid a lot of the issues in our economy and society bare, hasn't it? We knew they were there, and now we've seen them really clearly. Some organizations in the economy that are not valued, and the people working in them not valued. Some of our communities so negatively affected by the virus. Then, we always knew there was sort of discrimination, disadvantage, but the findings there around, BAME communities and COVID, shocking, but shared across the whole of Wales. And so now as organisations, public, private, whatever, we can pick those up and address those. So I think it gives us a chance to reset a little bit, and because we've already got that future generation sort of landscape, then we've got the framework that allows us to reset, doesn't it? And I think what Richard said is right. It is about saying this is a good place to live, to work, to study, to set up your business, to relocate your business. This is about the context that is it gives you a good quality of life. And I think our job is to sort of make sure that not just post-COVID, but we've got Brexit as well, haven't we? So trying to think those post-Brexit funds, you know, the green energy investment, how do we share these across Wales? If we've been guilty of anything, it's been about prosperity being developed in pockets of Wales. So we don't want to see those funds linked to the M4 corridor or the A55. We need them to be distributed more broadly, and we need to be spreading prosperity, but that quality of life more broadly as well, don't we? And that's one of the challenges that I think we face in Wales, is that prosperity has been limited, certain industries, certain parts of the country. So there's a challenge there, but I think that we have had a reset. And the genie is out of the bottle now. We know kind of what we need to do, and it is build on our strengths. But I think if we could just learn more from each other, I think we'd be surprised at how much is going on, and we could feel much more confident then about taking some of the steps that we know we need to take.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a good point to end. There's huge challenges, but also this is a potential opportunity for us to reset the economy and to involve all aspects of our society and economy in thinking about who we are as a nation, built around the ideas in the Future Generations Act, and including an engaged workforce in doing so. Thank you very much, both of you, for your time, and thank you to everyone who's been listening to the conversation. I've been asked to encourage people to tweet you and share your thoughts, so please do so based on the conversation. The hashtag for this is #EngagingLeadership, and the tweet handle, I guess, is @EFS Wales, @EFS Wales. So please do share your thoughts on the conversation, whether you agree or disagree, but it's important, I think, whether you agree or disagree, to have the conversation and continue to talk about how we do this. So finally, thank you very much, Rachel, and very much to you as well, Richard, for your contribution. I really enjoyed talking to you both, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye, Derek. Thank you. Bye.
Ar ran Engage for Success Cymru, hoffwn ni ddiolch eto i bawb sydd wedi cyfrannu heddiw yn ogystal â noddwyr. Byddwn ni heb wedi gallu gwneud hyn hebddo chi. On behalf of Engage for Success Wales, may I again thank each of our conversationalists today, as well as our sponsors. We could not have done this without you. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Ni'n gobeithio bych chi gallu fynychu'r sesiynau eraill a hefyd yn edrych ar y cynnwys ar-lein lle mae dewis o erthyglau ar gael. We hope you will tune in to our other sessions and also check out our content online, where we have a selection of articles. Diolch yn fawr iawn, cadwch yn ddiogel ac aroswch yn iach. Thank you, stay safe and stay well.